Hey, Media People podcast listeners, if you enjoy the podcast, then you're going to love our newsletter, appropriately named the Media People Newsletter. Delivered right to your inbox, each edition is a mix of original and curated content designed to feed your curiosity while aiding in personal development. On top of more podcasts, we'll connect you with articles, interviews, and industry events. Subscribe at mediapeople.ca/newsletter or go to mediapeople.beehive.com. That's BEEHIIV. Thanks for listening to the Media People podcast, lively and insightful chats with the people who power the media industry. I'm your host, Victor Genova. For more episodes, you can go to mediapeople.ca or subscribe wherever you get podcasts, including youtube.com/@mediapeoplepodcast. Views expressed by participants are personal. You might know David Cairns as the co-founder of Cairns Oneil, but the agency he started with Sherry O'Neill in 2012 is just one of the many companies he's had a hand in founding. In fact, some of those agencies became the entry points for international holding companies looking to enter the Canadian market. For example, David's first agency, David Cairns Company, was acquired by Aegis and rebranded Carat. But if you look back at David's passions in education, you would have thought a role in the creative services would have been forthcoming. A lifelong artist with degrees in visual arts and education, David worked for 2 years as an art teacher in rural Prince Edward Island. David returned to Toronto and took a job as a media estimator with Ogilvy Mather, and it was from there that his media career took off. David Cairns stops by to chat about growing up in Toronto, his passion for painting, working the late shift as a taxi driver, his career in media, and why every entrepreneur should have an exit strategy.
We're an independent Canadian media agency owned by Sherry O'Neill, myself, and Devin McDonald, and we were founded in January 2012, so we're 12 or 13 years old now. And what a media agency does and what we do is we design and execute media strategies for clients. In the old days, it was always about television and radio and newspaper and magazine. But more and more, it's about the digital world. And we use both syndicated and proprietary data and tools, modeling tools, etc. And we're about 50 staff now, so we've grown nicely. We work directly with advertising clients, closely with creative agencies, and obviously our media vendor partners. Well, as for my role, I have the title Executive Chair. I stepped back in April of 2022. I hate to use the word retirement because I'm still a shareholder in the company and still involved with the financial performance of the company and larger macro issues. But so that's why my title is Executive Chair. So involved in the board and longer term corporate direction.
David, thank you so much for stopping by today. As always, we go back to the beginning. Where are you from?
Toronto. I was born in Toronto in 1955, and my parents were from Toronto as well. They were the children of Scottish, Irish, and English immigrants. So I was born in 55 and lived, I guess, the first 24 years of my life in Toronto.
What was life like growing up in Toronto?
Well, it was a much different place than it is now, for sure. It was a very waspish, almost Victorian city. It was a smaller city. At that time, the subway, the young subway, only went until Eglinton. My house was at Mount Pleasant and Lawrence in Toronto, and so, if you wanted to go downtown, you went out, you waited for the bus, which would take you to Eglinton Station, and then you'd get on the train and go downtown. It was a great place, a great time to grow up. Lots of kids, obviously. We were part of the boom. So, schools had, classes of 30, 31, 32 kids. But it was a quieter place. There was no Sunday shopping. If you wanted to get a drink on Sunday, you had to order food with it. There weren't a lot of restaurants. There wasn't an awful lot of nightlife, with the exception of, bars on Yonge Street. There wasn't an awful lot more than that. And what I remember is, you could go out the front door. If you were a kid, 5, 6, 7 years old, you went out the front door and you were gone for hours. Like, they didn't necessarily know where you were. You might be at the park a couple of blocks away, or you might be many blocks away. one of my memories from one of my great memories from growing up is a friend of mine and I set up a stand in front of my house and sold all our comic books. I might have been, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old. And we sold our comic books and we made, about $2.59 or something. And we took that money and the two of us walked up Yonge Street about a kilometer, stopping in at various candy stores and variety stores all the way up. I mean, we were a long way up Yonge Street, crossing over from one side of the street to the other, get some pixie sticks here and some Liquimade there and some black balls here, etc. And then you arrive home, after like, 3 or 4 or 5 hours gone. A very different place than I think a lot of kids would experience now.
David, I'm a massive comic book collector, not as much as I was
Yeah.
in my younger years. And all I can think
Uh-huh.
about when you said that was, what kind of classics did you sell off for candy? Like
Oh
what
man, no.
specific issues that could be priceless right now?
Oh, of course, sure. Well, at that time, of course, it was a lot of Superman and Batman and the Flash, and also I remember liking Kid Colt Outlaw and the Two Gun Kid and those kinds of things. But yeah, but I don't think they would have been in any kind of collectible shape. They were not in pristine condition.
You stayed at home until you were 21 and you decided to move out and you stayed in Toronto. What was it about 21 where you said, you know what, I've got to leave the nest?
I'm not sure what it was about that specific age, except that I was changing, I was maturing, I was evolving, and I don't remember any discussion or pressure in my family about moving out. I just kind of felt it's what I should do. It was time to grow up, and I had gone to university for 2 years and was going to take a year off. And at the end of that year, I'd made a little bit of money, not a lot, and enough to pay the rent for the next several months. And um, just was really excited about, finding a place to live. And I don't remember my parents trying to talk me out of it. It just seemed like the right thing to do at the time. So I rented a bachelor apartment on Carlton Street, about a block east of what was then Maple Leaf Gardens. I think what is it, the Matamay Center now, I think, for $150 a month. And it was a bachelor apartment. And at the end of the year, they were going to raise my rent to $162.50. So I moved because the extra $12.50 a month was more than I could afford. And I found a place, fortunately, a couple of blocks away on Granby Street for $140 a month. So I was saving a lot of money by moving there. And I lived there for the next 2 years while I went back to school.
Let's talk about your interest in hobbies. You were very big
Mm-hmm.
into sports, but something that caught my eye, parallel between you and me, you read a lot and you seem to want to read biographies. Like biographies, you've got Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, Kit Carson. So what was it about biographies and what was it about the ones that you've highlighted here, these individuals?
Well, I remember reading those books when I was still in elementary school before junior high. So it would have been grades 4 and 6. I skipped over 5, accelerated as they would have said then. But I guess they were a lot of the books that the school library had. And I still love facts. I love nonfiction. I read much more nonfiction than I do fiction. And which is why I love Wikipedia so much, because anything I want to know, I can find there. But
I agree with you there, sir. I'm big into Wikipedia.
yeah, so I was just exposed to all these stories, largely about Americans. The young, Thomas Edison, and you know, I read, I read the biography of Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin. Uh, I mean, I was probably the only 10-year-old in North America reading about Eli Whitney. Um, and and I just really liked facts. And I know probably much more trivia than most people I know. I don't necessarily know how things work. I'm not scientific. I can't fix anything. I couldn't do any plumbing or electrical or anything, but I can tell you stories about people who were plumbers or who were electricians or scientists or people who discovered cures to various diseases. I always found that kind of fascinating. So it's kind of interesting to me that the things that you latch onto when you're very, very young, a lot of those things really stay with you. You know, that idea that you're kind of formed in the first few years, your values and your, you know, the things you like and the things you don't like, they really stay with you. So that's one of the reasons I'm interested in this, you know, what we're talking about here, because I've never really taken the time to think about the, those elements of my early life that had such an impact on me.
We're basically writing your Wikipedia page right here.
Yeah, right, exactly.
At this time, too, you also discovered visual arts. So how did you get into drawing and painting?
Well, I always liked it, and I I always, I think, was the type of kid who would be trying to think about other ways of doing things. You know, that there's a creative element to that, that you're given an assignment, but how can you twist it? How can you kind of color outside the lines? And I used to love doing projects in school because it was, you know, what those projects we used to do on Bristol board. You get a big sheet of Bristol board and you could, you know, do maps and, you know, various things. I really liked that because I could add images to those. But I used to do drawings of, comic book, you know, figures like, you know, the Wizard of Id and, you know, the Flintstones and, you know, Peanuts and those things. I would actually draw those things out. I didn't create any new comics, but I was just drawing the figures, and I like doing that. And I guess maybe by the time I was into junior high, that's one thing that people knew about me, was that I could really draw well, that I was, you know, artistically, you know, talented. So that was at a fairly early age. But, you know, I guess around the age of 15 or so, I started getting a little bit more serious about original artwork. And I had a dark room in my parents' basement, which was an unfinished basement, as all houses or most houses were then. And I had a 35 millimeter camera, and I would take the bus downtown and wander around the streets and take pictures of old buildings. And like, you know, the old City Hall and the old bank building that became the Hockey Hall of Fame, at what is that? I guess that's Young and Front. And then I would I'd have the film developed, and I would print those pictures, and then I would do pen and ink drawings from them. And I was doing that, you know, 14, 15, 16 years old. And both pen and ink and also, you know, just black felt tip marker drawings, and still have a few of them in my basement somewhere, and a couple of them ended up in, you know, high school yearbooks and those kinds of things. And then, I do remember, you know, right now there in Toronto, every summer there's the Toronto Outdoor Art Fair, and I have a distant memory of being in that. And I don't think it was called the Toronto Outdoor Art Fair then, but it was at Nathan Phillips Square at City Hall. And I remember having a stand there around 1970, 1971 or so. And I have no idea how I got into it, or, you know, whether I sold anything or, you know, but I was there. So, you know, I was getting more and more interested in art.
Why do you cite your father and your brother as being your biggest influences growing up?
Well, you know, I think, you know, when the question is, you know, what mentors do you have, or who did you kind of idolize? I mean, you know, I loved the movies, and I knew a lot about, you know, various actors, but there wasn't anybody who I aspired to follow. But I do think that with an impact on my life, my father was an accountant, and for an insurance company. So, you know, you can't get much drier than that. And when I think about, you know, my career, which in the media business has largely been about, you know, numbers and data, and analytics, he was a spectacular singer. He was a very, very fine tenor, at a time when you couldn't make a living at that kind of thing. You could be a wedding singer or a church soloist, and that's what he was. So he kind of lived for Thursday night church rehearsals and Sunday morning church service when he could, do the solos. And people always came up to me, and adults would tell me how wonderful a singer my father was. And he was in the Mendelssohn choir, just a very, very fine tenor. So there's a guy who had a very, I'm sure, and people who knew him in the insurance company would probably have been very surprised to find that what he really lived for was this creative outlet. And that's really my story. And my brother, who was also a very fine musician, did his Bachelor of Music at U of T, and is 8 years older than me, and was a very fine musician, and was in a couple of bands that played downtown at the time. And he became a music teacher, and ended up through much of his career living in smaller communities, never in Toronto, but in smaller communities in Southern Ontario. And I think about, when I left school or finished school, what did I do? I became an art teacher in a very rural part of Canada as well. So those are the impacts and the influences on my life.
Your very first job was delivering a newspaper. How did your paper route with the Telegram come about?
I guess it's the kind of thing that, kids did back then is have a paper route. And I remember there was a guy I knew, a kid from school, who had the routes in my neighborhood. And I don't know how it came to pass, but he wanted to give it up. And so he sold it to me. He sold me the route for $5. Yeah, I had to buy the business.
Very entrepreneurial. And, I've never heard of that. Yeah. Like, I've heard there have been referral fees if they can find someone to take the route that the company pays for, but I've never heard of anyone treating it like a franchise and selling it to you.
No, I know. Oh. And there were a couple of lessons there that, now that I think about it, because I would, every day I'd go up to the corner up at Yonge Street, and the papers would be dropped off, and I'd deliver them. And in those days, the paper boy had to collect as well. And you'd go around from house to house and ring the doorbell, and you'd have your little punch card or something, and hopefully people would be home, and they'd pay you for however many weeks they owed. And then and sometimes you really had to chase them down because they'd never be home or wouldn't answer the door. And then every Saturday I had to go up to the route manager's house, and he would tell me what I owed, and I'd give him all the money I'd collected, and he'd basically give me back, after I paid for all the papers, he'd give me my money. And I never made any money. I mean, I was, working for 5 days a week or 6 days a week, I guess, because it was a Saturday paper. And, and I'd leave his house with like $7, and I could never figure it out. And, one of the things you learn when you get into business is you have to know where the money is. It's the number one lesson I learned in my career, is particularly in running a business, is you have to watch the dollars. You have to know where the money is, both for your clients and for yourself. And in the 3 years or so that I had that route, I never could figure out. I don't know whether I was being swindled or what, but I never made any money doing that route.
But you also had a couple of other really interesting odd jobs. You were also working at a flower store, so you were picking up extra shifts during the holidays. Is that how it worked?
It's exactly right, because most businesses like that, on a typical day, they might have 3 or 4 parcels to deliver. Which is not enough to have somebody come in and do that for them. They may even had a delivery service, but at times like Christmas and Mother's Day and Valentine's Day, Easter, when the orders would really soar. I mean, at Christmas, the whole store was filled with poinsettias. And so I would, I really loved it. I'd go in and, there'd be all these parcels, and I started out as a jumper on the truck. And the jumper meaning, you sit beside the driver. The driver's got the map and the list of where to deliver to, and you pull up and you'd load the truck in order of delivery. So the the last ones to deliver are the first ones into the truck, and the first ones you deliver are the last ones in the truck. So you jump out and you grab one of these, and you have to get to the house at Christmas before the cold hits the plants inside the paper. So there'd be a lot of running, and I found it kind of, maybe it was my first sense of competitiveness, because I just really took pride in getting these deliveries made as quickly as possible. I really loved it, and it was hard work, and it was long hours. There were times during Christmas or Easter when I might still be delivering flowers. I could be starting at 9 in the morning or something, and still working at 7 or 8 at night. And I really thrived on it. I saw it as a challenge. I liked it.
I noticed that a lot of your part-time jobs didn't have you sitting still. Like, it was always you show up at base, grab what you need, and then you're out on the town.
I'll tell you just something that is kind of funny. Towards the end of my father's life, he said to me, he looked at me one day, and he was a very old man by that point, and he looked at me and he said, you turned out a lot better than we thought you would.
Oh, wow.
And when I was delivering papers, I was delivering flowers, and then I after the paper business in high school, I delivered catalogs. Consumers Distributing, which was a company that doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, I remember that store. I mean, it was just, you just showed up. They maybe had a couple samples out front, but you went to the catalog, wrote the number down on the card, and then, kind of like the beer store, they wheeled out your televion or your VCR.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly it. And yeah, so I mean, my parents were very kind to me, in that the catalogs would show up at the house, and they'd be in the front hallway, and before I could get through all of them, the next ones would show up. So the front hall was always full of catalogs, and my mother never complained. This was before Martha Stewart, so you didn't have to have a pristine house all the time. And I would, I think this was when I was 16. I had a driver's license, and I would, put the catalogs in the car and drive to whatever route I had to deliver them, and do that almost every day for, I don't know, a year or something. Always more catalogs to deliver when the catalog business, was really in its prime. And then, then I eventually, on the flower side of things, I eventually became the driver, and I guess there was a jumper sitting beside me, and got to drive all over the city. I became very knowledgeable about the city. Growing up in Mount Pleasant and Lawrence, I didn't really know too much about areas of the city like, Cabbagetown or Riverdale or Parkdale or anything like that. But I got to really know a lot of the city, and where all the hospitals were, and the funeral homes and all those things, which did me in good stead when I eventually became a cab driver. So,
which is something you don't see nowadays, because someone will get into an Uber or even a taxi, and it's all about the GPS. The GPS tells them where to go. They're just the pilot. They don't understand the neighborhood or know the neighborhood as well.
Totally. And I've been in many of those things where I'm telling him how to get somewhere, because he's using his GPS, and I think I know a better route. Yeah. So I and still today, I know the city extremely well because of that experience.
Why York University, and why did you choose to study visual arts?
I remember graduating from high school, and you have to remember, I was born in 55, so I graduated in 73, which really was still part of the 60s, that Woodstock generation. And I remember being shocked when I opened up the yearbook, and picture after picture of the graduating students would say, so-and-so's off to study economics at U of T. So-and-so's, going into pre-med. And I thought, nobody told me. All these people had plans. I didn't have any plans, but I was very good at art, and it was my top subject in high school. And I wanted to go and study art, but I didn't really think about where that might take me. If I had any kind of image, and I think this is something that I thought about in the early part of my my university education was, to become a starving artist, living in a garret somewhere, dying of consumption. That was my
Oh,
my
jeez.
goal. To be the kind of the Van Gogh kind of character. I did not want to become a lawyer or a doctor or anything to do with an office. My father worked in an office for 45 years, and I I thought I couldn't stand to do that. So really, that was the reason for me going into art.
So were you going all the way up to York University from the Carleton area? Because that's quite the commute. Back then there was no subway that took you right to York University.
That's right. So for the first 2 years I was at York, I was still living at home. And so I would leave my Mount Pleasant and Lawrence house and walk to the subway and take it up to York Mills. It went to York Mills. And then you would get out and you'd wait for a York bus, a school bus that would take you. So you'd get out of the subway and there'd be this lineup of like 80 people all waiting to get on the York bus. And you might not get onto the first one and you'd have to wait for the next one. It was cold, and it was, there were many days when it was kind of dark, in the winter, waiting for that bus. And then after I moved downtown to Yonge and Carleton, you're right. I would get on the subway at Carleton and take it up to, I guess, York Mills, and eventually up to Finch, because the Shepherd and Finch stations eventually got built. And again, take a bus from there to York. So it would take me, I don't know, an hour and a quarter, maybe at that time, to get to school and then back home at the end of the day. Yeah, it was a lot of travel, a lot of sleeping on subways.
Why did you follow that up with a Bachelor of Education from the University of Toronto?
I mentioned that I kind of had this vision of being a starving artist, but I think living on my own and having to pay rent every month and, feed myself, and the concept of needing money, really hit me. And I think that I started to think more about what am I going to do with this degree, and where's it going to take me? And because it was a fine arts degree, it wasn't going to take me into commercial art, or I didn't think it would. And I frankly didn't know if I was good enough for doing anything along those lines. So my brother was a teacher, and I think that had some influence on me, and I started thinking about education.
I always ask everyone what their first job was out of school, but you've got like a story within a story here, because you actually, can we say, took a sabbatical after your first 2 years at York
Yes.
to paint, work, and travel. So where did that idea or that motivation come from? How did your parents respond to that? And what did you do?
So good questions there. And I don't recall any serious discussions with my parents about taking a year off. I think it was common enough at that time, and even today. People nowadays still take time off to travel around the world, but my horizons were a lot more limited. But my idea was to take a year off school and find some jobs, and work on my painting, which I did. Painted a lot in that year at home. I was still at home. It wasn't until the end of that year that I moved out. And I, you get this idea in your head, and then of course the reality is much tougher. And I started getting jobs, and of course they were jobs that were dead end jobs, and that I failed at completely. I think one of the first jobs I had was selling theater tickets for what was called then the St. Lawrence Center. And, I answered an ad in the paper, and this guy, he really sold me on how well I could do. And of course, I was abysmal at it. I would, go drive to an area where there were offices, and I'd walk in and get off the elevator and ask if I could sell tickets. And of course, I think I sold one pair, and I sold another pair to my aunt. Uh, and that was it. And so after I don't know, they did it for 6 weeks or something, and that's all I could do. So I then got a job driving a taxi for Beck Taxi, and a lot of taxi companies at that time, you really had to be an experienced cab driver, but Beck, you just needed a taxi license, and then they would give you a car. And I had to go and get my chauffeur's license, and then I had to take a taxi training course, which was over a couple of days, where you kind of learn how to be a taxi driver and study the map of the city and learn where the rules of the road and all those things. But I would I was driving in the east end of the city, so around, think of kind of Woodbine and Queen,
Familiar with that
or
area.
that area, which is kind of in the beaches, but also all that area, and at late night. And I don't know, I have no memory of how I got down there or how I got home. I have a vague memory of taking a streetcar home late at night, but I was driving from 7 in the evening till 2 in the morning. And I was, 20 years old, and, driving around in a car in the middle of the night in areas that weren't very nice, by myself, and pulling over and picking people up and taking them somewhere. I don't know why my parents let me do it. I wouldn't let my kids do it. But it was a huge maturing experience, because these kinds of jobs I had, by the time I finished that year, I had a real sense that without an education, those were the kinds of jobs that were open to me, where you have no power and you can be terminated very quickly, and there's no future. And that was more of an education than I think I could have gotten in any kind of school at that point, about real life lessons. I worked as a busboy and then a waiter at a restaurant in the Yorkville area of Toronto, and I was fired because I'd been on my feet for 5 hours, and it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was still business, and I'd been on my feet for all that time, and I just wanted to sit down. And at the end of the day, they told me not to bother coming back. There were probably things, legislation and help for those kinds of people now that maybe didn't exist then, in terms of fighting the labor, or fighting with the labor board or something. But it was a real education. I had a job, again, answering an ad in the paper, to work at a flyer company, a newspaper flyer in Unionville, which was when that was really farmland. I got a car and would drive up there through farmland, past cows, to Unionville, to work the phones and try and sell people ads. And my job was to look in other papers, like the Scarborough Mirror, and find ads and call those people and try and sell them on advertising in my paper, in my flyer. And the first week I did really well. And then after that, it just kind of went down and down and down to the point where I wasn't selling anymore. And they said goodbye to me. So I had about 4 jobs, at least in that year, where I, didn't succeed, and was happy to go back to school at the end of the year.
I want to touch on your job as a taxi driver. 2 other creative people, David Mamet and Larry David, both of them drove taxis early on.
Yeah.
And I just looking at that, between your experience as a visual artist at the time, it's just what is it about creatives driving taxi cabs? What the attraction is there? Because even David Mamet has said in an interview that if things weren't working out for him as a playwright when he was trying to get out of it, he had no problem going back and driving a taxi. That's as if it was a calming thing for him.
Yeah. And I think for my situation was different, but in that I was a student taking time off and, trying to get jobs to save up enough money so I could move out of my parents' house. Whereas I think there are a lot of people in the arts who, they're in between gigs, they're auditioning for roles that they don't get, or they're taking acting classes and they need a job. It's often, a waiter or waitress job, or a cab driving job, or a truck driving job. But what they really want to do is get an acting job. And I think the world is full of those kinds of people. And it's interesting because, one of the things that I remember thinking is, and it's still with me today, that you need to respect people regardless of what they do. You don't know that person. That person who serves you a cup of coffee in a little diner, or somebody who picks you up in a cab. You don't know their life story. You don't know what they're dealing with, and you don't know what their skills and their aspirations are. But everybody has them. So again, that was a lesson for me in treating people well.
No, I completely agree. When I have the chance to lecture in the college advertising program, my lecture is around networking. And I have this part in my lecture where I say to everyone, look to your left, now look to your right. And I said, there's a good chance you just saw your future boss. Letting people know that there's kind of like, yeah, sure, you're all on the same level. But after about 3 or 4 years in the business, you're going to find out who's going to take time to climb, who's going to stagnate, and who's going to go all the way. And you might be working with them. So if you're letting your guard down or not pulling your weight during group work, they're going to remember that when they're hiring a media supervisor.
Absolutely. And, something I've said to many people in our industry is it's a small industry. You're going to keep running into the same people over and over, and you'll either be working for them, or they'll be a client of yours, or you'll be a client of theirs. So you really have to remember how you treat people, because you'll run into them again.
We're going to take a quick break. Enjoying this episode? Of course you are, or you wouldn't have made it this far. Complement your listening experience by subscribing to the Media People newsletter at mediapeople.ca/newsletter or at mediapeople.beehive.com. It's a mix of original and curated content designed to feed your curiosity while aiding in personal development. On top of more podcasts, we'll connect you with articles, interviews, and industry events. Subscribe at mediapeople.ca/newsletter or mediapeople.beehive.com. You teased this earlier on, but after you got your Bachelor of Education, you went out to PEI to teach art. Tell us a bit about what that experience was like, because I have to imagine that the classroom experience was far different from what you had as a teenager in Toronto, where you said, there were 30 plus kids in a classroom. It was during the boomer generation. So what was it like out there?
Well, it was a shock. When I finished at York, I went to U of T and got my Bachelor of Education. And I started applying for art teaching jobs all over Canada. And I think I wrote to every school board, answered every ad that was posted in the paper at that time, to school boards in Northern Ontario or Labrador, or on Indigenous reservations. And the one job interview I got was from Prince Edward Island. And when you talk to people, you say to people Prince Edward Island, everybody thinks Charlottetown, but I got the job 2 hours west of Charlottetown. Now, Charlottetown, PEI is not a big place. So 2 hours west of Charlottetown is like 12 hours north of Toronto in terms of difference.
Gotcha.
It was a very, very rural community, agricultural and fishing community, where everyone is either related to each other or knows each other, grew up with each other, and very hard to fit in. And particularly when you're from a place from Toronto, like Toronto, that nobody thinks good of Toronto if they live in a small place like that. It was a junior high school, grades 7, 8, and 9, and I had there were 500 students in the school, and I had all of them for my art classes. And the school, the classes were divided up into, there were some classes with very bright kids, really these winner kids, kids who were interested, kids who came in and wanted to listen to you and really have a good experience. And then there were kids who just were in just very difficult. I remember in my first year, I had a grade 7 class where there was a 17-year-old boy. It was his 5th year in grade 7.
Oh, God.
And I remember saying to one of the teachers, who was a nun, why is he still in grade 7? And her answer was, because he's never done anything to pass. And that was true, that there were a lot of kids there who would, they wouldn't show up at school until, after agricultural season was over, farming was over, or, they'd leave in the spring once fishing season started, because they were helping their families. So you could stay in the same grade year after year. That was, again, a huge eye-opener for me. It wasn't what I expected in going to teach at a place like that. That my budget for the year, I was given a budget of $1,000. It might have been $1,100 for 500 students, for art supplies. So that caused me to get very creative about what you could do with pencils and paper.
Jeez, I was going to say, yeah, that is very limiting.
Very limiting. And so it was also a challenge because my wife and I were married in this 3rd week of school. I flew back to Toronto. We were married. We flew back to PEI, and Monday morning I was back in class, and she was sitting in a cabin thinking, what have I done?
Okay, so let's talk about your formal foray into the media world. Okay, so how did you find your first job at Ogilvy Mather?
After 2 years in PEI, my wife and I talked and decided that this was not something that we should be doing for the rest of our lives. And I'd also come to the decision that the observation that working in the public sector or in the education system, you're not necessarily rewarded financially. If you can be a good teacher or a bad teacher, you can be a very committed teacher. You could be somebody who just shows up, and everybody gets paid the same.
It's a very good point.
I had this vague notion that what I wanted to do was to get into business, where if I really applied myself and worked hard, I would, make my fortune. But I didn't know anything beyond that. What business? What kind of business? I had no knowledge of how the world worked from a business perspective, and so I was really floundering in terms of what should I be doing. And I answered an ad. There was an ad in the paper. I think it was a 2-line ad, and it was something like advertising agency, Media Estimator, university degree, good with math. Call this number. That was it. And I responded to it because I knew the term media, not how it is in the advertising world, but it's an art term. The medium is the message. The
Marshall McLuhan.
Art is, yeah, right. But that media is an art term, and so I called. It was a placement firm. I had an interview and had to do some aptitude tests, and they sent me to Ogilvy Mather, where I was one of 4 people hired that day. Again, we all had to do aptitude tests and profile tests and be interviewed by about 8 or 9 people. It was an exhausting afternoon. And I went home and told my wife that I got the job, and she said, doing what? I said, well, I'm not really sure. It's something to do with ads, but I don't really know what. It had never occurred to me that when I watched TV and there were ads on it, that somehow advertisers were paying money to be there, to be in front of my eyeballs, and that's how the media made their money. I knew nothing about that stuff. So anyway, I was really surprised to find that I enjoyed working in an office, that the people at Ogilvy Mather were charismatic and funny and interesting people, after having been in Prince Edward Island for 2 years with the teachers at the school I worked at, this was really refreshing for me. And like my father, who'd worked 45 years in an office, there I was working in an office and finding I liked it.
As a visual artist, were you coming into the industry thinking like, and you see this with a lot of young people when they come into it as well, they kind of conflate
Mhm.
media and creative, and they think, oh, brainstorms, storyboards, I'm going to be on set, art direction, and things like that. But then you found out very quickly that no, the media side of the business is, like you said, budgets, spreadsheets, dollars,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
forth.
Well, there's a couple of things. The first thing is I very, very quickly learned that what I was doing in the media department at Ogilvy Mather was something I really actually liked. There was this other side of my brain that liked connecting, dots, and liked adding up numbers and working with budgets and eventually working with television ratings and understanding the research technology behind those things. But I have to say, I think that I doubted myself from an artistic perspective, that while I was, you know, a good, I was good at drawing. The term in the advertising world is that is about people who are creative is creative. They're the creatives. And it's not that they can draw, it's that they can take um, a brief and create a selling proposition from that brief, and develop uh, a sales pitch that we call an ad. And I didn't have those skills. I had drawing skills.
What brought you to Chiat Day Canada?
After 6 years, I left Ogilvy and I got a job at Ted Bates as a media supervisor. And one of the accounts I worked on was Nissan, although it was called Nissan. And I was only there for 9 months. And in that time, I impressed the people I worked with and the clients. And um, Bates was part of the Backer Spielvogel empire. And they had two agencies in Canada, Ted Bates and Straight and Pearson Holman, I think was the name of the agency. And they were merging them. The problem was that the other agency had the Hyundai account, and they also had it in the States, and they were going to have to resign Nissan. And so Nissan worked with Chiat Day, which was their agency in the States, to come up to Canada and open an office in Canada. And I was invited by the account director, who was assembling a team, to be the media director. And I remember going home telling my wife this once in a lifetime opportunity. I had 6 years experience, and they wanted me to be the media director at this new agency, which I'd never heard of Chiat Day. I mean, everybody else in the industry, certainly on the creative and account management side, knew about Chiat Day. It was famous. I'd never heard of them. But it was just a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I was scared to death because I had no idea who they were. And I was, a young father with two kids and a mortgage. And I had many sleepless nights of, um, what if I don't do well? What if I lose my job? What if I can't do it? And um, I remember asking my daughter at the time, she was very young. She was like, I don't know, 6 or something, 5. And I said to her that I had this opportunity to do this new job, but I didn't know if I should do it. And she said, well, I don't think you should, because what if that job is cleaning windows on a big, high, tall building? And what if you fall off? Yeah. What if I fall? What if I fall off?
That is quite the metaphor that you threw out there.
Absolutely. So I accepted the job. Then I turned it down. Then I accepted it again. Then I turned it down. I mean, they must have thought I was just an incredible loser, but they kept coming after me, to their credit. And it was a once in a lifetime opportunity for sure. It made my career. I almost was too cautious, but it worked out very well.
So even though you said your words, you started off terrified at accepting this position, clearly it gave you the confidence to move out on your own because you left Chiat Day to go out on your own. And let's start first with Cairns and Company. What was the problem you were looking to solve? Like, what opportunity did you see in the market for yourself that you said, aha, I could capitalize on this? And where did you get the strength? Where did you also get the strength to do it, given in your previous role, there was so much personal uncertainty around it?
Well, there was still uncertainty here. What happened was that Jeffrey Roche was the first creative director at Chiat Day, and he left after a year or two and started his own agency. And after a couple of years, he called me to have lunch, and I thought he was going to say something like, I've got this agency and it's doing really well, and I need a media department, and I want you to come and be my media director. But that's not what he said. What he said was, I can't find anyone in the business who thinks like I think, and who I can work with from a media perspective. And I think you should leave Chiat Day and start your own company. And I've got clients who you could work on, and we can pitch business together. And I said, wow. I said, well, would I just be working? Could I work with other? He said, yeah, sure. Yeah, I just need access to your brain. Those were his words. I'd never thought about running a business, having my own business. It never occurred to me in my life, in my mind. How do you start a business? And I went back to my job at Chiat Day, and then Jeffrey would call me, and I'd think about it, and I'd do some research, and then I'd keep working, and months would go by. And again, to his credit, he kept calling me. I pick up the phone and there'd be this, David, where are you? And eventually it was about a year until I finally decided to do it. And once I did, it kind of took off. And I realized that back to your question, what the opportunity was to apply experienced senior management to clients who were not getting that in the agencies or with the agencies they were involved with, where work was being channeled down to junior people. And here was a guy who had by that time had, I guess, 12 years experience and was a media director with an award-winning agency who would actually do their work, do their media planning and execution. And that was a fairly compelling position in the market at that time. And when the article came out in the trade press, I got calls that day from people who wanted to hire me. So within 3-4 months, I had about 5 clients. So started working in my basement, and after about 5 or 6 months, we were able to get our first office and start hiring a few people and learn how to do that. My wife did all the admin work and payroll, and had to learn about payroll taxes and EI and all those things. And I was the front man for the agency. And we had that agency for several years, and it grew every year. You look back and you wonder how these things happen.
You guys were so successful that it was Aegis, not even called Dentsu Aegis back then. It was just Aegis came in and purchased the agency. And so this is an interesting point in your career because you spent the last couple of years being your own boss, a lot of success. You're acquired, which is what a lot of people look forward to, like that sort of exit. But you stayed on with the company. I don't know if that was part of the contract, but here you are at a company that you built from the ground up, took it to that next level. Someone comes in and buys it. And it's kind of like, if I can use this analogy, it's like you sell your dream house to someone else, but then you're still living in it or you're renting it out.
I didn't enjoy it. And I've talked to other people about this over the years, and people will say things like, look, the entrepreneur always leaves. They always leave. At the time, what was happening was there was a tremendous amount of consolidation in the industry, and globalization was happening. And we were, a smaller Canadian media agency, and we had global accounts on the Canadian side of things. And suddenly decisions are being made in Germany or in London, and the account leaves because of a decision made somewhere else. And it was a bit terrifying. So when we were approached by Aegis, which had the Carat brand or Carat brand, they wanted to acquire us, and we would become Carat Toronto. And then they also acquired an agency named Stratagem in Montreal, and that became Carat Montreal. And then they eventually put the two of us together to become Carat Canada. And I did chafe. It was a different culture, and not a bad culture or a good culture, just different. And after a year, I gave them a year's notice. And you're right that there was an earn-out. It was a 2-year earn-out. And so either one of us, either side, could give a year's notice. And so that's what I did after a year, so that I would be there for the next year for the earn-out, and then I would leave. In fact, I ended up staying on for a while to help to consult with them, but eventually, terminated every relationship with that and moved on.
And you went back out on your own again, and you founded or co-founded Asylum Think Group. So where did that come from? Let's start first with the name Asylum Think Group, because I think that's a great name.
Well, that name, I remember when that name came to me. I was mowing the lawn in the backyard, and I was thinking about names, and I'd been very taken with the name Asylum. David Geffen had a record company called Asylum. What I liked about it was this image or this notion of a place that could provide refuge for people who, maybe were getting a little beaten up within the holding companies of the world and wanted more freedom to work. But also the flip side of what Asylum is all about, for lack of better words, it's where at that time, where I thought, where crazy people go. I guess now you would say where people with mental health issues might go. So it was because of the notion of the agency world being full of, crazy people. That's where the name came from. But the Think Group part of it was the consulting aspect. And I saw Asylum as a place where senior experienced people from other agencies, media directors who maybe didn't want to do what they were doing anymore, could, within this group, work with partners on their own assignments, their own projects. And that's what we did. There were 4 of us. 2 of them, Janet Callahan and Terry Sheehy, were both very renowned media directors from J. Walter Thompson and Leo Burnett. And then the 4th was a fellow named Marty White, who was a very experienced media sales executive. So we had both media buying and media selling experience within that group. So that was the idea.
You get a phone call from Bob Shropshire. He's Dentsu's president, and I believe he was a former colleague of yours at Ogilvy. He gives you a call while you're out, while you're doing work with Asylum Think Group. What does he ask you to do?
So I guess we were in maybe our 3rd year of Asylum. And Bob asked me, I knew Bob from my first week at Ogilvy. I think he joined Ogilvy, I don't know, 6 months before me or something. And he had he'd gone into account management and ended up as the president of Dentsu, which at that time was called DCC. And he asked me if I would, as a project, design for him what a media department could look like, what it would cost, what resources would they require, what kind of people would they require, et cetera, how many people would there be, those things. And the reason was because DCC outsourced all of its media strategy and execution to a media agency. So I did that as a project and, costed out everything and laid out an org chart. And as I did it, I became more and more interested in the idea that maybe the person at the head of that org chart could be me, that maybe it was time for me to go back into the agency world, but not as an owner, not as an entrepreneur, because it's a lot of pressure. And I wasn't ready for it, but, I knew Bob. We were pretty good pals and still are. And, but to get to start something, to start this department at this agency, and that's kind of been a theme through my career, is starting things, whether it was at Chiat Day or Asylum, or DCC, and then of course with now with Cairns Oneil.
It's kind of like your role's been, I guess, the role of a general manager or a coach with an expansion professional sports team. I'm trying to think of it, like as an analogy. I'm like, that's what it seems like, because it's like you come in, you're running the show, but there really isn't a show yet. You know when there's going to be one or there's going to be a team, but it's up to you to put those pieces together before you can do anything else.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. And what happens, is as time goes by, you learn and you become more confident because you know what situations may arise and how you are going to manage those situations. Where, when I had the opportunity with Chiat Day, I was terrified. I didn't know really where to start. But after some years, I knew what I was doing.
So when you did this at Dentsu, what did you do differently, say, from the previous times you had to build a media team from the ground up?
Well, I was fortunate in that Bob was very open to anything I wanted to do. And of course, I had the template already in place from the consulting project. I knew what the team should look like, and I knew what the resources were required. So I set about, putting those people in place and putting the research elements, et cetera, in place, and also working with. There was another agency involved because DCC or Dentsu shared the Toyota account at that time with Saatchi, and so there was a media team over there. So we had to work with them as well. But by this time I knew how to work with creative people. I knew it, and I think this is something that maybe I haven't really touched on enough, but I think is very important. Is because of my art background. There are people in the advertising world who are really, one side of the brain or another side of the brain. And I think if there's anything that really helped me, was to be both sides and to be able to work with creative people, feed off them, help them, give them thinking that maybe they hadn't thought of, and work as a team. And so at Dentsu, working with those creative people in-house, and to be able to walk into a client's office as part of the team as opposed to a department, really led to success.
Okay, so let's bring things full circle about the idea for Cairns Oneil and where it came from. And I want to start by saying, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned that one of the things you enjoyed about taking the role on at Dentsu is that, like, it wasn't an entrepreneurial venture. So you didn't have all of those extra stresses on top of you, and that you didn't want that at this time. So what made you want to embrace those again? Because I think this is your third company that you've started.
Yes. And it's a really good question because, before Cairns Oneil, I probably told many people that if I was to ever start another company, I would want a partner, because it can be very lonely. When things always look worse in the middle of the night, when you wake up and something's on your mind and you're thinking about, an account that is going to go to review, or a senior person who has resigned, or, an account you pitched and you didn't get. It always looks terrible in the night. And then you wake up in the morning and you have to solve that by yourself. If you have a partner, somebody who you can bounce things off of, somebody who can stabilize you when you're worrying about things, someone you can help. Just having a partner also, it can help you be the strong one on occasion. It brings good things out. So when I had the opportunity with Cairns Oneil, it was about partnership. And what happened was, when I had resigned from Dentsu, I didn't know what I was going to do, so I gave a long lead before leaving, like several months. But the word got out that I was going to be leaving, and a very good friend of mine who I know from Ogilvy Mather, Ann Myers, referred Sherry Oneil to me. Sherry had gone through some real success in other areas of the business, but at the moment was not working, and thought there might be an opportunity for her at Dentsu. So she called me, and we got together to have a coffee, and we quickly morphed from talking about Dentsu to talking about the industry and the things that excited us, the kinds of projects and challenges we liked, and by the end of it, and of course the frustrations in the industry. And by the end of our coffee, had one of us said to the other, maybe we should do something together. We'd never met. We didn't know each other. We'd never worked together. And yet, after one conversation, we were saying, maybe we should work together. Maybe we should do something. And what Sherry remembers is that afterwards I went back to my desk and I sent her an email saying something like, that's the most exciting conversation I've had, in years or something. And of course I was still at Dentsu, so I still was working on accounts there. But Sherry, like Jeffrey Roche years earlier, started, sending me articles, doing analyses, establishing some budgets, how we might go to market. And after several months, we did. And we just really kind of, I believe, came to a point where we saw, much like earlier for me, that we saw a similar opportunity, that again, a senior managed media agency with senior people actively working on client accounts was a hole in the market that we thought we could fill. And that's how we launched.
Compare day one of Cairns Oneil with what the agency looks like today.
Well, it's funny. When you start a company, you don't really know, are we going to have an office? Are we going to work from home? What clients will we have, and what will our revenue be? And so we tended to be a little cautious. Initially, we're working from home, and maybe, got a little bit of shared space here and there from people we knew. It was Sherry, myself, and a young lady named Trish, who was our coordinator. And so it was the three of us. And today the company is about 50 people. And we have a president in place who we recruited a couple of years ago, and allowed me to step back. At the time when Sherry and I started the company, again, 12 years ago, we said, well, we'll need a digital manager. We'll need an internet person. Well, now, 60 or 70% of our business is digital. There are things people are doing in this office that I'm not quite sure what they do, because things have really changed in the world. But yeah, it was the right time for us to do it, and it's been really successful.
So when do you know that it's time for you to take a step back? Like, are you still having fun, or is there something else that you want to do with your life?
Well, there's something, yeah, more other things I want to do with my life. I worked for 2 years as a teacher, and then what am I? Was it 46 years? 42 years, I guess, in the advertising industry. And it was time. I mean, Sherry and I, almost from the time we started the agency, had talked about what the future would be, and what our exit strategy might be. And that was something else I learned over my career. When I started David Cairns and Company, I don't think I even knew the phrase exit strategy. And I would, that would be my biggest piece of advice, I think, to anybody starting a company is, when you start a company, you have to think about how you're going to get out of the company. And you have to know that when you start. You can't be thinking about that, 10 years later. So we had talked about, when that might be. And, it was a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, when the two of us sat down, and I said, okay, I think I'm ready. And Sherry said, yeah, she's almost there too. And we decided that we would look at a staged approach to what you might call retirement, and that we would need the next generation in leadership, and make sure that person or people would be in place well before either one of us step back. And so Devin McDonald joined us, I guess about 2 years ago now, a good 2 years. And I stepped back in April of last year. So he was in place several months before I stepped back, and it was pretty seamless. And in terms of how I feel, great. I don't think about the industry that much, and I certainly don't think about the daily issues that the agency might be facing. I do think more in terms of, as I said, the larger kind of financial performance, and any kind of large risks or liabilities we might be facing, and how do we get in front of those. But I don't wake up in the morning wishing that I was still in the office.
Do you dedicate a bit more time towards painting?
Yes, I paint most days. I haven't for the last month or so, what with the holidays. But my life in 2023 was cycling, traveling, and painting. And I was able to get into an art fair in Riverdale. I also joined a couple of artists groups. We got some showings various places, and have made a lot of connections with people who I wouldn't have met otherwise. So and learning about the concept of the idea of painting. I always say to people that if you're a musician, you play guitar, you take your guitar out of its case and you play, and then you finish and you put the guitar away, and it goes in the closet, and that's it. But with art, it goes up against the wall, and then another one leans up against it, and your house can become full
Yeah.
of art. You really do need to think about what is your strategy for getting your art into the hands of other people, because otherwise you'll need to buy a bigger house.
David, before we close, I just want to let our audience know that I did extend an invite to Sherry Oneil to participate in a separate podcast. She declined at this time, but we do have a standing invite with her, and we hope to have her on. David, are you ready for rapid fire questions?
Sure.
The campaign you are most proud of?
I can't tell you. I've worked on hundreds, and they get dim in my memory. But if the question was, the things that I'm most important of, or most fulfilled by, is working with clients who tell you that they, had never imagined that, media work could be as great as what you're delivering, or, creative partners who talk about how wonderful it is to work with you. Those kinds of things have really um, have really made me feel very good about you know the work I've done. And hiring junior people, hiring people out of school, and seeing them, giving them opportunities. I think about in the agency, Cairns Oneil, the jobs we've created over the last 12 years, and those people we've hired who either are still with us or have moved on to other places. I'm very proud of that.
Your favorite movie?
Again, I hate to tell you that I can't think of one, but I will tell you several that if favorite means, watching over and over and over again, I love Bullet and Vertigo, which I was actually just watching a couple of nights ago. I PVR'd it. The Godfather, both one and two. Also, Anatomy of a Murder, which is an Otto Preminger film from the late 50s with James Stewart and Ben Gazzara, Lee Remick, and love that film. It's a Wonderful Life. I've watched many, many times. I love the message in that film of the importance, the impact that one life can have. It really resonates with me.
I love that you've got Bullet in there. Immediately, the poster comes up where it says it's got Steve McQueen's silhouette. There are good cops, there are bad cops, and then there's Bullet.
Yeah, right.
Oh, there's just something about chase scenes from, like, because I like that film, the chase scene in the original Gone in 60 Seconds, where I find that chase scenes are perversed with special effects nowadays, where everything had to be filmed in camera. And there's one scene, I don't know, you've seen it, and I don't know if they don't really talk about this too much because there's not really a lot of coverage on Bullet, but there's a scene where he comes around the bend and he actually tank slaps the car,
Crashes
his
into a
Mustang.
car.
It crashes into a car, and there's a bit of a cut there. And
Yeah,
apparently they had to cut it out and then also pay the guy because they wrecked the guy's car. And I
right.
just knowing that no one really seemed to pay for any permits in San Francisco. They just set up the cameras and said go. And that's what they did with Gone in 60 Seconds too. They would clear the crowds out, car would come flying down, and then they would yell cut, and everyone would fly off to the next place. And they'd try to stay ahead of the police because they weren't sure if they were going to be called. So I'm glad that you have Bullet in there.
Well, I was just going to say that, one of the differences between the way the films were made, a number of years ago and the way they're made now is they can, people died.
Yeah.
People were maimed and injured. Stuntmen, stunt women were, sometimes killed, and so they can make films now with, digitally and with all kinds of effects that is much safer, but it never seems quite lifelike. Not yet, anyway.
If Hollywood were to make a movie based on your life story, who would you want to play you?
Assuming it could be someone who's no longer around, I maybe someone like James Stewart. I think about what people are, what makes them tick, and when I think about James Stewart, the roles he played and the person he seemed to be in real life, somebody who stands up for his beliefs, looks after his family, cares about others, a bit of a loner, which I certainly am. Sometimes wears his emotions on his sleeve. You maybe slow to anger, but can really lose it, which I can do. My temper can sometimes get the best of me. Somebody who says, does what he says he's going to do, and is a nice guy, not necessarily a cool guy, but a nice guy.
My follow-up, if Hollywood were to make that movie based on your life story, what would you call it?
That's a great question, and actually, it's hard to kind of think of that something right away. But in the early '70s, there was a movie made by Lindsay Anderson with Malcolm McDowell. Not about the advertising industry at all, but the title is "Oh Lucky Man," and that's what I think I am.
Your favorite book?
Well, you touched earlier on all the stuff I read when I was a kid, and I do have a thought on kind of favorite author. Let's say I do like noir. Not necessarily mysteries, but noir, and I've read a lot of like Jim Thompson and um, you know um, people like Patricia Highsmith. But my favorite is probably Raymond Chandler, who created the character Philip Marlowe, and in books like The Big Sleep and Farewell, My Lovely. So that would be my answer there. I love the writing style. I love the character. Very analytical, slow to action, more of a thinker, and honest.
Your favorite song?
So I have, very eclectic tastes. I'm not necessarily an expert in anything, but I love jazz and I love big band. And, when I was going to university, I was listening to big band. I was listening to Harry James and Benny Goodman and Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald when I was, 22, 23 years old, which kind of eyebrows were raised and people heard the kind of stuff I was listening to. But I don't necessarily have a favorite song, but I do have a song that again resonates for me, and it's a song called "For a Dancer" by Jackson Browne. So this is about a 50-year-old or more song, and "For a Dancer" he wrote as a eulogy to a friend of his who had died, and it puts the notion of dancing into life, that we're all dancing through life. And that while we're not alone in life, but in the end we are. And the words are, do the steps that you've been shown by everyone you've ever known, until the dance becomes your very own, no matter how close to yours another steps have grown. In the end, there is one dance you'll do alone. And I think that's a very powerful image.
Best advice you have ever received?
I didn't have to think long about this. When I was really struggling to think about if I should join Chiat Day, and taking the job and then not taking the job, back and forth and back and forth, I asked my former boss at Ogilvy, whose name was Nesreen Medhani, what I should do, and she said, "David, do it. Think of the experience you'll get. If it doesn't work out, you'll get another job like that." Like just, and I think she might have even snapped her fingers like that. It was really empowering to hear the confidence in her voice that, because there I was thinking about, I'll never get another job. And she was right. So it was great, great advice.
My signature closing question: if you weren't in media, what would you be doing and why?
I'll answer that a couple of ways. The first is to say that I probably would be a painter, which, as I mentioned, is what I spend a lot of my time doing. I do have a need to be creative, and all through my career, I found ways to be creative. I love the idea of creating something that didn't exist before, that, in this entire history of the world, that doodle you do on a page has never existed, never been created by anybody. So I really enjoy creating art. I enjoy looking at my work. I continually see new things in it, but I doubt that I make a living at it, because very, very few people do. So if I wasn't in media, I might be doing that, but you wouldn't be talking to me because I wouldn't be able to afford a landline or a computer or something. But my final thought is that one of the things I've learned over my career is that the world needs all kinds of people. Everybody contributes. Everybody, it's like a football team. There's a quarterback, and there's an end, and there's a center, and they all play a role. And you can't have a team without all those people doing things. And it's the same in society, where we need teachers, and we need insurance agents, and we need barbers, and we need homemakers, and we need entertainers. And if you're lucky, you find the thing that you were meant to do, something that stimulates you, that makes a contribution to your community and supports you and your family. And the reason I said that I call the movie "Oh Lucky Man" is I was lucky. I answered an ad that took me into a career that I knew nothing about, didn't even know it existed, and I prospered in it. And my bad early experiences, in the year I took off school, really taught me to be grateful for that.
David, this has been a fantastic chat. Thank you so much for your time.
I enjoyed it completely. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
That's it for today's show. For more episodes, you can go to mediapeople.ca, your favorite podcast platform, or youtube.com/@mediapeoplepodcast. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram @VicGenova.